Item 9, which is affordable housing report on inclusionary zoning and options in that area. It's on page 39 of our agenda, and I'll ask our staff to come to the table. We've got Claire Walsh-Shaw, Principal Planner, Phil Reid, Manager of the Auckland-wide Planning in the Plans and Places Office, and also Karina Fassenklut. Now, I hope I've got that right, Karina. Good. And Principal Solicitor in our legal unit here. And we do have David Norman. Is David there? I can see him behind Karina. David, if you want to come up, there is another seat there. And David, of course, is our Chief Economist. Now, I think, Claire, you're the principal author of this report, aren't you? Always good to ask the person that does the hard yards writing the material to present the report, and you will. And we've read your report, and you're going to take us through a short presentation, and then we'll pose some questions. So Claire, in your very capable hands, and welcome.
Cool. Kia ora tātou. Just some background to the report. In March 2019, the Planning Committee requested staff to investigate regulatory and non-regulatory interventions, including the modelling of inclusionary zoning and other planning mechanisms and incentives. At committee 2 months ago, the Affordable Housing Work Programme was approved, and that included a return and a report back with further detail on inclusionary zoning and the options available to Council. So the report considers four options available to us: inclusionary zoning in both a mandatory and a voluntary form, value capture and targeted rates. And the report also looks at the experience from the unitary plan, special housing areas and Hobsonville and Queenstown experience. And all this against a backdrop of house prices continuing to increase across the market. So I'll just take you through those four options. For the mandatory inclusionary zoning, that would require a change to the unitary plan, and that might look like a requirement for a percentage of affordable housing or land above a certain threshold, and that would be for residential development. So some of the pros, this would be a clear change and a signal that changes the council's role in affordable housing, and there's potential for significant long-term impact towards improving housing affordability. So there's a number of cons, and there's quite a significant risk that a plan change would not be successful. Again, a significant time and cost commitment in taking forward a plan change. Also, it might not result in additional overall supply. It might just shift the balance of our supply. There would be an additional cost to the residential development industry in meeting the requirement. And at present, we don't have clear legislation supporting inclusionary zoning. So the next option is voluntary inclusionary zoning, and this is usually advanced through an incentive-based mechanism associated with additional site density or site coverage, additional height, or it might relate to a fast-track consenting process or fee waivers that are available when affordable housing is secured. So some of the advantages, again, this is a change in council's role in affordable housing, but this might be potentially less contentious as a plan change because it's on a voluntary basis. Some of the disadvantages are that we no longer have many other controls on density are no longer available in most residential zones. There's no clear effects-based link between the development and affordable housing, and therefore an increased level of risk to the integrity of the unitary plan. And again, we might not see a large contribution in terms of overall additional supply. It might just be a rebalance. And it can signal that the unitary plan is willing to accept breaches of the development controls that are in place in the unitary plan. So we also looked at a value capture approach, whereby that unearned increase in land value that becomes available on rezoning or infrastructure delivery might be used by council towards affordable housing. So some of the pros are that this approach would not necessarily require a plan change as it sits outside of the planning system. There's an opportunity to secure affordable housing in locations that benefit from good infrastructure provision, so in some of our more accessible locations. But on the other hand, it might be limited to those locations, so it wouldn't be funding necessarily available across the region for affordable housing. And again, this is one option where legislative reform would be required to enable a levy for affordable housing. And the next option we considered was looking at a targeted rate, and this might be a targeted rate that's set across all residential rateable properties with a link into the long-term plan. So some of the advantages are that it could be levied over a specified time frame and charged in advance, and that would secure a revenue stream available for affordable housing. Also that it's spread across all ratepayers rather than tied specifically to development activity. And we could use the existing partnerships that council has with community housing providers. Some of the disadvantages relate to the obvious additional rates burden on households that would be, or that might be across the board. The significant costs and risks with the implementation of this option. And again, one disadvantage is that it's not directly related to development. So there would need to be some direction about where affordable housing might be delivered. So this just looks at those four options and how they might fit in terms of the criteria up there. So in terms of strategic alignment with council's agreed intervene and lead approach, they all rank quite highly. In terms of impact, the mandatory approach could deliver significant numbers of affordable homes, as could the targeted rate potentially. In terms of cost, it's quite, it's really related to risk, I guess. So the risk for taking forward a mandatory inclusionary zoning approach through a plan change is significant. So the risk and the cost are significant. In terms of effectiveness, I guess it's the same. The mandatory inclusionary zoning and the targeted rate approach could be quite effective tools. So those key trade-offs across the options are really the potential level of impact and the level of the cost and risk to council. And just to restate what we said two months ago, the current legislative and policy context remains unchanged since the unitary plan was adopted, and there's currently no clear pathway for supporting inclusionary zoning approaches. And the other options to secure affordable housing also come with significant risks. So given those risks outlined above, we're not recommending changes to the unitary plan at this stage due to the current legislative and policy context. However, to continue with the intervene and lead role through a coordinated advocacy plan to central government by the political working party, and with the hope that this will enable strong advocacy for legislative change required to enable the use of inclusionary zoning by local governments.
Thank you, Claire. Now, members, we are aware of the working party, so I'll defer to Councillor Bartley again, along with Councillor Casey and Cooper, who have been focusing on this. We've got the staff recommendations before us, and I probably need to check on what the political recommendations might be if they differ to the staff recommendations. Councillor Bartley?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The political working group was sort of that sounding board for officers on this report, and had differing views on the options before you. So apologies, we can't give you any clear guidance, councillors, on where our political working group is at, but we were just going to agree that this was just going to go for debate. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take questions now. I don't have any amendments or other motions before me in advance, so I'm assuming the officers' recommendations. Look, they are before us now. So I'm going to call for a mover and a seconder of the officer recommendations. That's a move from Councillor Cooper. Do I have a second for the officer recommendations A and B before us, please? Councillor Fletcher, thank you. They're on the table, but we'll take questions first. And if we can keep the questions separate from comments. And Councillor Casey, please.
I'd like to hear from the lawyers as to why this is now a high risk when it wasn't a high risk when we put it through the unitary plan.
Thank you. Through the chair. We always like to identify risks with any plan change approaches. We obviously put forward the mandatory inclusionary provisions in the unitary plan as notified in 2013, and that was the subject of a lot of challenge through submissions that the council's approach was ultra vires, that it was unlawful, and that was the way the IHP went with their recommendations, and they recommended to the council that the provisions be deleted. So the same submissions are likely to come forward on any future plan change in the current legislative and policy context, and that's where we see the risk.
Phil, can I ask you why the planners supported it going through the unitary plan and now they don't?
Through the chair, I think at the time there was probably still a legal settling of understanding about what mandatory inclusionary zoning was within the scope of the Act. So Queenstown Lakes District Council was going through the courts at that point. The contracted consultant that we used to help us prepare those provisions had worked within that Queenstown context, and there were considered to be benefits from the approach that were found within the Auckland plan, and we were looking to try and achieve those outcomes in the Auckland plan at the time.
Either of you, on what do you base the statement that a plan change is likely to be unsuccessful?
It's quite likely that the same protagonists that were involved in that process through 2014 and 2015 would re-enter into submitting on such a plan change again if it was to seek a mandatory inclusionary zoning. As I mentioned in September, the National Policy Statement on Urban Development is now with us, which has as part of its prime purpose a focus on affordable housing. Yet within it, it still focuses on the element of supply and not looking at implementing through a tool such as inclusionary zoning. So that was also considered to be a signal that the policy context hasn't changed from that time.
Last question. In terms of a challenge, a court challenge, how does that figure in your risk assessment?
I think there's a number of different elements of risk in going through the plan change process. So the first step would be the ability to find someone whose professional reputation is willing to stand on Section 32 that recommends the notification of such a plan change. So we'd first need to secure that individual. Then moving into the submissions to actually look at all of the issues that come through submissions and the strength of those and the experts that are lined up through the hearing process. Then there's the element of what appeals may come in and to what courts those appellants are willing to actually continue to progress those appeals. So there's obviously very significant financial costs on us through that process, and there would be a significant degree of analysis of the professional opinions of those involved in council's case.
So your professional opinion is it's too big a price to pay?
My professional opinion is that if you were to progress a plan change and you were to actually get through those hurdles and you were to potentially get to an end of probably about a 2.5 year period, the likelihood of success in my mind would still sit around about 10%.
Can I just ask a supplementary to Councillor Casey's questions there about risk and possible legal challenge? So, Karina, this is internal advice that you're offering us from your unit on the legal risk. There was, at that time in 2016, an external provider of legal services. Was it Simpson Greason? Look, I probably won't speculate on the name, but was that company, was their advice sought on informing this paper?
No, the legal advice of our legal provider at the IHP hearings was not sought. That particular legal provider is no longer with that firm. But when we're looking at risk, I think it's important that we identify that it's possible that a plan change could go through, but we can't guarantee that it would. What we're saying is that this is likely to be the subject of significant submission, as it was with the unitary plan provisions, that those submitters, if they don't like the council's decision, will appeal it. And as we've seen with the other affordable housing case law, it's gone on, not just to the Environment Court, but to the High Court. So we're talking about significant legal costs in these types of plan changes. So that's what we're identifying as the risk.
And you've weighed those so-called significant legal costs against the enormity of the problem.
Yes, we have, and we've also noted that the courts that have considered this to date haven't yet made a finding on whether affordable housing provisions are a tax, a subsidy, or I think the other term they used was licence. So that hasn't been determined yet. But the recommendations of the IHP suggested that such provisions were a tax. So that's the only real guidance we've had to date on whether the provisions actually form the basis of a tax, in which case they'd be unlawful. So.
Okay, and just again, a supplementary to Councillor Casey's question and your reply, Phil, in terms of finding somebody to write a Section 32 and support that statement. Now, I understand Hill Young Cooper was the consultancy that led this work on behalf of the council, and it was one of their senior partners, David Mead. So to inform this, have you tapped into Hill Young Cooper's incredible knowledge of this area and David Mead specifically to inform this report?
Only insofar as going through all of the evidence that David prepared.
So they haven't been contacted?
If we were to progress a plan change, we would probably go back to David again and check on whether or not anything in his understanding has changed from that time.
Yeah. Okay. Councillor Cashmore, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I think, Phil, I think you've already answered my question I asked about the MPS on urban growth, where you said the government specifically did not include inclusionary zoning, so that's telling us something, isn't it?
Yeah, that's my inference as well.
Councillor Coombe, please.
Thank you, and thanks for this work. There's some good information here about the options for addressing affordable housing, and some of them are tools that we might want to use that are non-planning tools. And I just wanted to clarify that that work is going to continue through a different work stream, so particularly around the value uplift and using rates to address other issues, not just affordability, that this isn't going to stop that work that I understand the finance team are still looking at as part of the LTP process?
Through the Chair, I'm not completely aware with what the finance team are looking at through LTP for targeted rates. We did call on their assistance to look from a just a theoretical perspective in setting out what targeted rates are. But you are right in that, yes, we would be looking to work with the political working party on an ongoing basis towards February and forming up a coordinated advocacy plan, which would include a number of things to central government, of which value uplift capture could be within there.
Oh, thank you. I think they weren't looking at a targeted rate, but the rates differential for undeveloped land, which can have the benefit of improving affordability, but it's the main tool, it's not for that purpose. It was more about encouraging development. So I just want to make sure that if we pass this, it's not going to shut down any other good work that's happening, because we're just saying here that we're just not going to continue with a planning tool.
That's correct. And yes, either a taxation-based or rating-based incentivisation scheme to look at enabling housing product to come to market, which may otherwise not because of speculation or land banking.
Yeah.
They would certainly be things that we'd be looking at.
Great to hear. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Coombe. Councillor Walker, please.
Got a few questions, if that's okay, Mr. Chair.
How many's a few? Because I don't
About
want to be
three.
rude, but
No, I like to
don't
warn
want
you in
6.
advance. I'll be as
Thank
quick
you.
as I can. Because I know you like information in advance. So I've just got a question around the value capture levy, and I just want to apply the information that I've got in the agenda item with that risk analysis, because I don't understand the high risk. If the value capture levy is dependent on a change in legislation from the government, and the government changes the legislation, then it's not a very high risk, is it? So I don't quite understand what the issue with that is.
Through the Chair, we were reporting on risk as it stands at the moment. You are correct that if the legislation did change and enable a pathway to be able to charge a value uplift levy, then yes, it would change that risk profile.
So there's no reason why we couldn't proceed with that. And if that value capture levy is higher in locations that are very close to public transport nodes and the like, that might also correspond with locations where it's desirable to have inclusionary housing for affordability. Is that not a fair premise?
Through the Chair, I think the issue is whether or not there is policy work which pursues an outcome which is currently not legally available to us, and how far we go with that policy work.
Okay, the other question I've got is just around voluntary inclusionary zoning, and we could have a plan change around this. So what say there's somebody out there in the marketplace, that could be a developer, could be Kāinga Ora, that's quite happy for a plan change to overlay their area that covers off inclusionary zoning. Is that then high risk, or is that very low risk?
Through the Chair, if we were to progress a plan change which was pepper-potted in particular locations of only where there was ownership support for such a scheme, then yes, that would change the risk profile. But our analysis was looking at this as a plan change which would apply more generally.
Okay. I guess through you, Mr. Chair, I'm just trying to get a foot in the door. The other question I've got just goes to this comment A. It's just around timing. A reads, agree not to make changes to the unitary plan due to the current legislative and policy context. Is it necessary for us to move something like that now? I mean, do we need to even move that at all? And my question around that is, by leaving the situation open, don't we keep our options open? Whereas what you're suggesting here is we move something that actually closes options and may close options prematurely, particularly given the other things that might happen. So why have we got A?
Through the Chair, yes, I do have a degree of sympathy with that. I think planning issues do need to be approached as they change through time, and I wouldn't like a resolution to cut off our ability to address an issue if the available pathway becomes available.
Do you agree that A is a cut-off?
through the chair, when drafting this, again, it was looked at this point in time, and retaining the ability to report back to you again should the playing field change for us.
You, Mr. Chair, A is not just at this point in time. A is forever as it stands, unless we
So
rescind it.
maybe I can help there, and I think you've raised a good point. And look, it has been moved in second because on my notes here in my agenda, after the words Auckland Unitary Plan, I've got at this time, then carrying on to read due to the current legislative.
I don't see that.
So it has been moved and seconded. So I need to seek, maybe we take some other questions, and you and I might get some support in that regard in terms of amending it. But maybe that's for something that the mover and the seconder consider, and then we will.
I'm fine with that. I mean, the word current, to me, that's the trigger. Because what we're seeing is basically, unless we can get some legislative change, we can't do anything. So that to me signals is the minute that happens, we can look at it. But if people feel more comfortable to put at this time, and if Councillor Fletcher agrees.
So if we could add the words, and thank you, Councillor Walker, at this time. Now, further questions. Councillor Watson, please.
Yeah, thanks. Just a couple of questions of clarification that go to some of our other forays into the world of affordability. The first one to do with the special housing areas there. Just the figures that are quoted in terms of the relative affordable sites and the retained affordable sites consented, and I'm reading this in conjunction with the request for, for some sort of central government involvement for more robust monitoring system. Am I right to assume that there's then no real follow-up or certainty as to how many of those progress to actually be relatively affordable or retained?
So just through the chair, so these figures came from two reports in 2017 in August and October, and I think there's been a decision to focus on improving Council's approach to monitoring going forward, and I'm not aware of any further follow-up on these numbers.
Okay, so we just don't know, do we? Is there some total response to that?
Through the chair, I'm happy to add to that. Thank you, Claire. Look, we've always had difficulties in being clear and monitoring through the SHAs what kind of affordable housing has been provided. So the answer to you is no, we don't know. In order for us to know, notwithstanding those numbers, which they have some accuracy but are not fully accurate at all, will take weeks and weeks of time. And there was a lot of discussion, particularly with Councillor Darby at the time, around where our energies and time would be best used. And it wasn't to try and retrospectively try and figure all of this out. It was more about towards the future. So the answer to your question is no, we don't know.
So good. So I think it's important that we establish whether something's been successful or not, and that clearly hasn't. In terms of
Councillor Watson, if I can come in, I've just received an email at lunchtime in answer to the question that I copied to you. In fact, you were asking it, I was asking it. I think Councillor Collins was asking it as well, about how many affordable housing units were delivered under SHAs, actually delivered. They were required to have declarations. There was supposed to be a process in place. We monitored them, etc. Unfortunately, government gave us no support. We're talking historically, but there was no support to actually put in a monitoring regime. And I have received information today that some 1,766 were consented. But I'm not convinced that that's the number that was delivered, because they required declarations. I know of a number of SHAs where people came before you and I and others making those applications with the great promises, where there was no affordable product delivered, none whatsoever. They walked entirely away from it. So I think it is a fair question to go hunting on. This information, I'm told in this email, took 5 days of staff time to find those indicative numbers. That is how hard it is to find, because really there is no tracking, as there should have been. Now, that's a failure of us and government. It's not just government, it's a failure of us and government to ensure that monitoring was put in place to identify not just the supply of housing, but the affordable housing units. I've been hunting that, you've been hunting that for a long time, but my follow-up question is, how many declarations were confirmed? And I would say it's significantly lower than the 1766. Leave it at that. But I, in some ways, I don't really want to get the staff to go and spend another 5 or 10 days hunting all this information.
No, I think you've just made the point, and that's all we're interested in doing here. It wasn't too impressive. In terms of Hobsonville, and it goes to, in some respects, to one of our presenters this morning. We're told here that point 42, 32% of all homes sold to date were classified as affordable, and helpfully down below we're told what that affordability level is in real dollar terms. So since 2017, that the price cap was around 650k. So 32% of all homes in Hobsonville were classified as affordable. Am I reading that correctly? Because I would have to say, Mr. Chair, that bears absolutely no relation whatsoever to any cursory examination of the sales of the various precincts around there at all. In fact, I think it was Brennan said today he had a look, and that would correspond with my analysis of a 2-bedroom apartment at 639k being about the cheapest thing you can find in Hobsonville Point. So that's a pretty start. 1/3, 1 in 3 houses there are affordable. I would question that.
Through the chair, and you can see there it's taken directly from Hobsonville Point sustainability report. So I don't know that there's been further investigation into those numbers beyond what was reported there.
Well, just finally to finish that one off, if you go and look at any of the sites on your laptop, you'll see that apartments are generally around about 650k. Terraced housing is you're lucky if you get anything at 900, and anything above there it's 1.2, 1.3 is often the more common. So I will follow that up myself, but I would question the validity of that assertion in this discussion of affordability.
Fair questions. A member Tauhenere.
Kia ora, Chair. Did you have an analysis or by kāinga ora on the mandatory inclusion of the mandatory inclusionary zones? Did they do a risk analysis, or did you do a risk analysis?
Kāinga ora, as they were Housing New Zealand at the time through Kāinga ora, and as they were Housing New Zealand at the time of the unitary plan process, were not part of the all-of-government submission that was opposed to the mandatory inclusionary zoning provisions. The other observation would be that the model that is used by Kāinga ora is different from the private market model in terms of their generally third approach to what they provide. The analysis that we've done has been looking at the private market focused.
So, with regards to the recommendation, is the recommendation asking the council to lobby government to do a job so that it becomes easier for the council to come up with the mandatory part? Is that what that says?
Through the chair, I think you do touch on a good point. So the advocacy to central government could be with 2 angles. One angle would be within the legislative and policy sense in terms of what are the tools which are made available to local government to seek through its unitary plan a plan change that supports inclusionary zoning. But there could be another angle to central government, which is in relation to its housing provision through Kaingaora and what it chooses and the way in which it provides that.
So if the government makes a provision for mandatory inclusionary zones, does that make it easier for council or not?
Through the chair, there's probably a little bit of clarification needed there. So Kaingaora in its own operating model would not impose upon itself a mandatory inclusionary zoning model. Mandatory inclusionary zoning should be looked at as a regulatory tool that sits under the RMA itself. So Kaingaora would continue to make its own decisions about the product that it brings to market, and we will be advocating on that decision.
Last one, if we were to have a provision for mandatory inclusionary zones, how would that impact on the work of not only sort of private developers but also the providers like Kaingaora?
If we were to have a scheme similar to what we had in 2013, which was if you provide more than 15 dwellings within your proposal, then you have a choice to either have 10% relative affordability or 5% retained affordability. If that was applied to Kaingaora, it may well change the way in which they bring their resource consent proposals through to council.
And can I just point out to you that in point 80 in the Maori impact statement, the Kāinga Strategic Action Plan, is that the IMSB's Kāinga Strategic Action Plan? And if so, can we change that to including responses to the IMSB's Kāinga? Just a bit of thing about them. Okay, kia ora, thank you.
Thank you, and going forward, we will make a note of that. Thank you. Councillor Cooper? Question?
Just a question around, you talk about groups that would challenge this. I mean, in the unitary plan process, Kaingaora, or Housing New Zealand as it was then, made some significant challenges to our plan. Is that right?
Through the chair, yes, they did.
And do you think they would do that again, given the government hasn't actually put inclusionary zoning in the government policy statement about urban development? Good enough. So do you think that's still an option? That is a possibility that would end up, or is that kind of weird given they're social housing providers, but then they're also in the market and affordable?
Yeah,
it's just something I'm thinking about.
It's probably crystal ball gazing too much to actually drill into the detail of what might be their motives for submitting or not.
Yeah. I suppose for me, it's just that they were one of the biggest anti our unitary plan that there was, and if we get in their way, just like they're kind of changing the playing field for us now, basically turning upside down our unitary plan, it wouldn't surprise me. So that's just, I suppose, a sort of a question and an observation.
Just a supplementary to that, just clarification, the MPS on urban development, we submitted in favour of consideration of inclusionary zoning in our submission, did we?
I might have to defer to the Director of Strategy on that, because I was working at central government at the time and didn't follow what council's submission was.
Okay, the suggestion was they decided not to include it. Did they decide not to include it, or are they possibly addressing it somewhere else?
Through the chair, in looking at the associated material, including the regulatory impact statement for the NPSUD, I didn't see that there was a specific analysis on inclusionary zoning and a purposeful decision not to include it.
So we can't make any assumptions about the government didn't do it. It could be on the new government's political radar. We just need to find out. It could be in the RM reforms.
Well, through the chair, you will see within paragraph 63 that there has been consideration through the new directions for resource management in New Zealand in relation to value capture and targeted rates, which was also then focused on this issue of the ability to be able to provide for public goods which could include affordable housing. So there is a general consideration of this going on, as far as I understand, but I'm not aware of any particular piece of work which is looking to create a regulatory setting for us to support a plan change.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Newman, please.
Yeah, you've kind of answered my question there, because actually it would be reasonable to say that central government has had ample opportunity to address this through legislation with respect to housing and urban development. They didn't do it there. Instead, they relied on the National Policy Statement on Urban Development and relying on kāinga ora, which is different from addressing the matter of providing a permissive planning framework through law for inclusionary zoning. Would that be reasonable?
Through the Chair, yes, I'd agree.
Okay, Chair, I reserve my right to speak.
Okay, thank you. They're all the questions, I think, at this time. They are. Now, we've got the motions before us, members, moved by Councillor Cooper and seconded by Councillor Fletcher. Slight amendment at this time. I'll take speakers. Member Henry, please.
If you read the Maori impact statement, 78, 79 and 80, if you read 78 and 79, you get the feeling that you should have mandatory inclusionary zones because of what it says in 78 and 79. And then you read 80, and then it says what we should be doing is knocking on the door of government to ask them to take a lead. And that's cool. But what it doesn't say is that if the government takes the lead, we will then change our thinking. What it says is that, yeah, they'll change their system, they'll change legislation, but that actually doesn't mean we'll do anything. It doesn't say we will do something to respond to that change. All it says in B is agree to a coordinated advocacy plan to central government. Shouldn't it mean, or shouldn't it say somewhere that we will do this, and when they do that, we will do this? And that's my only point in not agreeing with B. It leaves it too much in the ether without a decision. We're putting it all on central government, and that's cool. They deserve to get a smack every day of the week. But in return, shouldn't we be committing ourselves to what essentially we're asking them to do? If you get my drift. So anyway, that's where I am, and because the case for the inclusionary zones is made in point 78 and 79. Well, from a Maori perspective, not a developer's perspective or anything else. But if you want to change the way Maori get on the ladder in terms of home ownership and affordable housing, then this is all good. And what we're doing is really, really cool, but we're not committing to the whole game plan. We're only going halfway by suggesting to government, you change your game plan, and what we're missing out on is saying, if you do that, we will change our game plan. And that's the part that I can't agree with. Sure.
Councillor Newman, please.
Yeah, look, it is very interesting. I won't be voting for B if my vote against B can be recorded. I mean, look, the special housing area I mean, it's a very interesting discussion. We date back to that. I've always regarded the SHA as developers' lotto, a great way to add value through zoning, changes to zoning, but with no evidence that the benefit will be passed on. And I think that the whole scheme was laughably cynical at the time, which is why I voted against the extension of the accord between council and central government. Chair, if you want to credibly advocate on B, I would suggest that you and the staff spend 5 days auditing those SHAs to see how many declarations you can find with respect to affordable dwellings that were yielded through the accord. Go and source the information, Chair, because that is the best possible evidence for the policy intervention if you agree with B. In fact, I think that the SHAs got so bad, it's really opened up a really festering sore out here, Matau, such as the legacy of that scheme. I think it's noteworthy, and it's addressed in the report, starting at paragraph 59, that inclusionary zoning has not been an item for legislation. It would be fair to say, I think, that the government's had a good go on this. It's had every opportunity when legislation was passed for housing and urban development. No inclusionary zoning. We've got a national policy statement for urban development. We've got kāinga ora. Do we have inclusionary zoning in the Resource Management Act? No, we don't, thank goodness. In my view, for council, what I think we try and do is we try and address the issue of affordability, because we sort of feel that we have to do something for the community. We do have to do something for the community. Right now, when it comes to affordability, what this council needs to do, Chair, through its planning and asset development and budget, is address the deficit of water, wastewater, stormwater, parks and reserves, community facilities, all of which are the demand is exacerbated through zoning, whether it be inclusionary or whatever, and yet we don't seem to have been able to address that. We talk about it, but we haven't been able to do it. No, but we're not going to do it here. We're just going to talk about inclusionary zoning because we feel it's a nice thing to do. Well, I would like us to address the affordability of planning and zoning in the context of the things that we actually are supposed to be doing, which is about addressing the transmission infrastructure to accommodate all of the growth, whether it be in brownfields or greenfields, and leave this stuff alone, because actually government doesn't require it of us, and for good reason. It doesn't require it of itself. Its contribution will be through kāinga ora, and I don't believe that kāinga ora is going to pay up. So, Chair, I understand the sentiment that some people have around the need to have coordinated advocacy plans for engagement with central government to advocate for some. I don't think some people know the consequences of what they're asking for here. I'm voting against B, and if my vote can be recorded against B, I'd be very grateful.
Thank you. Councillor Casey, please.
It's another one of these speeches. Closing the door to inclusionary zoning is closing the door to one of the few tools that this council has to make our city more affordable and let poor people live in nice areas. If you do a search on Trade Me property at the moment for properties under 500 Ks, you'll find there's about 800. I didn't do it myself, I've stolen somebody else's research. Of those, there's about 406 apartments, 27 townhouses, 93 units and 293 houses. God, I hate this. I'm not going to do the speech I was going to do. Shepherded this through the unitary plan, sent it off to the commissioners, it got sent back to us. They're telling us, no, it can't be done. You're telling us again, it can't be done. And it can't be done. But what we've got is a city that's becoming gentrified, not becoming gentrified, is gentrified and is becoming much worse. All the build right now through the unitary plan in my area, and John, you're right about Hobsonville. You're right about every street in my ward that's being what do you call it? Intensified. The people who are buying those houses are people who can afford to buy them. And to live in this city and buy a house, that was going to give you all the stats, that's 500 or less, you have to go, Linda, way out west or way down south. You can't even do it out west, way down south, Pukekohe or even further. That's what we're building. And that's why it grieves me so much that this tool that makes people do what we want to do. That's the city I want. I want them to do that. They're not going to do it by themselves. Of course they're not, Daniel. There's no incentive. Of course not. I got that. But it was one of the few tools that we could make them build the city we want. We're the governors of the city. And it can't happen. And so this is the second dead rat today, because I'm going to vote for this. Because we can't put ratepayers' money at risk on a plan that's bound to fail. We won't even get a planner that's going to put their name to it, right, Phil? Yep. So, oh God, I hate this job. Sorry, Joe, about the last one, but I hate this job sometimes. That's it. No, so that wasn't the speech. Oh, and I'm really glad with B, because I'm going to be part of that. So is Joe, so is Linda. We're going to thump the table and tell them what we need in this city to create the city where everybody gets a go at living in the leafy suburbs. Everybody gets a go at that. Don't know how we're going to do that, but we're going to look at every nook and cranny where these tools might be hiding.
Thank you, Councillor. Mayor Goff.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Look, I support in principle both inclusionary zoning and value uplift. In principle, first of all, inclusionary zoning, because I like to think that the sort of suburbs I grew up in Three Kings and Papatoetoe, and the schools I went to represented a whole cross-section of people of different socio-economic levels. And you grew up thinking of yourself not as rich or poor, but as part of the wider community that makes up our city and our country. It was probably a bit easier in the 50s and the 60s because people still remember the war when people made equal sacrifice, and therefore we had a more egalitarian society. You know, we're all regarded as New Zealanders. People put their lives on the line for their country, and we weren't going to turn our backs on them when they returned having done that. But we've lost a lot of that. And I'd like to see us gain some of that back. And I hope I'm not just being idealistic about that. It is the sort of society that I believe in. Having schools where you mix with people from across the board and you're all part of that community. Didn't we put in our Auckland plan that we were going to be an inclusive city? Well, that's what the word inclusionary actually means. And value capture, you know, if Auckland Council rezones my territory and says I can divide it into residential property and I make a fortune because of the actions of Auckland Council, should I really keep all that windfall profit? What did I do to deserve that? You shouldn't. And if, you know, the harder one is if you spend let's make it 5 or 6 billion on, say, a light rail system, and suddenly the value of your property goes up. Maybe we've got to investigate whether some of that comes back to the people that added the value to your property. So in principle, I support both of those things, but in a sense, inclusionary zoning is a means to an end, and the end is affordable housing. And we're not just looking at one instrument to do that. And I'm conscious of the work that David Norman's done. And, you know, in the unitary plan, we zoned another, 2 million enabled property sites, but that's pretty theoretical until you provide infrastructure. So if we want affordable housing, one way of doing it is building a whole lot more housing, and I think that's probably where the thrust of it is, but it doesn't rule out the principle of inclusionary zoning. And I think that we should explore that, and I think those that have raised the points that the government hasn't put it in its national policy statement does tell you something, and it means that we've got a bit of a battle, just like the Productivity Commission said. They ruled it out, just like the Independent Hearing Commissioners ruled it out. But I don't think we stop exploring that because the principle is right. And
to get it to work, we need to find out the right way to get it to work. And that's why, I think B is really important. We need to engage with government on that. I think we will get value capture. Stephen Joyce talked to me about supporting value capture. So did Phil Twyford. And it's in the paper that was presented under the resource management proposals. So B says, look, we can't do these things on our own. Therefore, we've got to advocate, debate, discuss, explore. And we've got the perfect vehicle to do that with the local government New Zealand remit passed by 86% of the councils around the country, to sit down with a working party, with the government, to explore the whole range of issues involved in affordable housing, because nobody doubts we've got a huge problem there. So I think we should do that, and we should look at whether we can get the government to develop a national policy statement on affordable housing. I think that's really important. The 4 options put in front of us, I think, really good that you've spelt it out clearly. Can we do a targeted rate for affordable housing? Jesus, we're having trouble getting a targeted rate on some more specific things that many of us around this table want. I don't think we're going to get the electoral support or the councillor support for that. Can we do voluntary inclusionary zoning? Well, we could if we had something to trade off, but you've told us quite rightly we don't have anything to trade off. So we still want to look at the mandatory inclusionary zoning, and we still need to look at the value capture. But both of those things require legislation, and Phil just was checkmate for me. What chance have we got of winning this before the court? 10%? Really? Are we going to spend our money fighting a court case that we've got a 90% chance of losing? Of course we're not. So I think the recommendations are right. We should do this. We should do that allied to the other local government New Zealand advocates of this policy, and we should be sitting around the table with the new government to talk about what are your proposals now. Forget Kiwi Build, that's the past. What are your proposals now to get affordable housing? And that's the discussion we need to have, and those are the people we need to have it with. So I support recommendations A and B. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mayor. Councillor Watson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I guess I would say at the outset that there certainly has been a lot of talk around this issue for many years, and that's why I asked my questions at the outset, Mr. Chair, in terms of what's happened on the ground, because some of us in here have trod down this well-worn path for a number of years now, and forgive my cynicism, but we don't seem to be too much further along that path in any practical sense. I was one of, I think, 7 councillors who voted for the inclusionary zoning when it came before the unitary plan decision making back in 2016. So even at that stage, it was a relatively small percentage of the councillors before some of the impediments that the officers have pointed out to us that have subsequently appeared on the scene. When I look through what's been really promised in terms of the unitary plan and as it goes to affordable housing delivery, it's been incredibly underwhelming. So in my ward in particular, we are a model for all the housing typologies that were meant to bring down the price. I mean, east, west, north, south in the Albany ward, wherever you go, out to Whenuapai, up to Milldale, you've got all the terraced housing apartments, you've got the you've got the apartments, you've got the single dwellings on much reduced sites, but their prices are all astronomical. They're just out of anyone's reach. Far less this new quotient of people, the intermediate housing market. And I noticed that figure stopped at 2018. So that increased from 66 to 89,000 households to 2018. I shudder to think what it is a couple of years on now, because there's been another dramatic growth, as we're all well aware of. So it really occurs to me, Mr. Chair, is, well, what is our role? We banter around the word affordability and affordable housing without any real clear way forward other than talking to the government. And when I look at countries around the world that have made a dramatic change, and I don't think there'll be anyone around this chamber that will be suggesting that it has to be something dramatic that's going to reverse this kind of escalation, up over the $1 million for just an ordinary type of house. It's not going to be addressed by tinkering around the edges. If you go to countries like Chile, for instance, they had a massive house building program that was successful in the early 2000s as a consequence of cooperation between central government and local government that utilised the land of the local government and utilised the ability of the central government essentially to fund. This was the poorer part of people in Chile, not entirely dissimilar to the old state advances corporation that used to exist in New Zealand, which enabled people in the 60s and 70s, no matter what background really, to largely walk into a new house in one of the new subdivisions, whether they were in Birkdale, Henderson, Manariwa, Papakura. It was very easy for people to access that. Now, we haven't in our discussions heard any suggestion of something that's really a bit of a change, a real step change. And the Mayor quite rightly talked about it being a new government. We need to go and see them, because really it's going to come for them. I guess what I object to a little bit, like Councillor Casey, is that it comes back and we kind of play pretend a little bit that we are going to have some sort of meaningful impact here where we're not, and we haven't. So that might be a good starting point in our conversations, to say, well, look, guys, what are we going to do? We represent Auckland. This is beyond the pale, and the notion that somehow we're going to pull the rabbit out of the hat without something really groundbreaking is just not a fair one to be giving out to people. There's young people, young professionals sitting there waiting for the rabbit. Well, it's not coming. In fact, the rabbit's getting burrowed further and further down into the hat. It's harder to pull out. So I think, for what it's worth, that we need to be incredibly honest and open in our discussions with the government when we have it, and to state things as they are, and perhaps to be a little bit more public about that, rather than playing the kind of game, despite the best efforts of our officers, that something is going to occur out of all this that is going to make a difference, because it's not. And in our heart of hearts, we all know that.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Henderson, please.
Thanks, Chair. Look, I'm much like Councillor Casey and Councillor Watson, who made fantastic points. I'm planning to vote for it, but I can't say I support A. In fact, I feel pretty sick about voting for it. However, I'm very glad that B is there. I support B very much, and more strength to the arm of the people that are taking up that fight. I really hope you win. Because inclusionary zoning is great. I mean, internationally and nationally, evidence is showing that it's working. It's actually doing the job that we need it to do. And we, frankly, need to do something about affordable housing. We needed to do it 15 years ago. And we can't just try the same things and expect a different result. That's the definition of madness. People are being priced out of their neighbourhoods and their communities that they identify with. I mean, goodness me, you wouldn't believe this. My mother-in-law grew up in Ponsonby, back when you didn't need to be a millionaire to live there. And that is one of many suburbs in the city that have transformed into a gentrified place. And it's not just socioeconomically. We don't just need to provide homes for people and the opportunities that come with that, but it's also socially. We need people to mix with people that are different to them. We need to build our city not just economically but socially in that way. And so I'm a big fan of the aims of inclusionary zoning, and I really hope that we can convince the government to that change. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Henderson. And Councillor Walker.
Cool. So, just for the record, I'm going to be voting against A, because I think this addition of "at this time" just doesn't cut it.
I'd like to donate to the government.
If we're going to push on something, the time needs to be now. So I'll just string a few comments together. I certainly agree with the other commentators that we have to go into the government and spell out the unmitigated disaster that was the special housing areas. We know that because we've seen it. I've consistently been asking for that information ever since the government did it, and we haven't done it. So some of us have been on record asking that things be monitored from day one. And to learn that that hasn't happened is just, that's literally chaos. I certainly think that inclusionary zoning works. We know it can work. We know it can deliver. And as Councillor Henderson mentioned, it means that you will have affordable homes mixed in with less affordable homes. So you've got less of a chance of getting ghettos and undesirable social arrangements. It's actually socially a good proposition, and I would suggest aesthetically it is a good proposition, and it leverages those developers, because they will be developers that are building the high-end stock, so they know how to do that, to also build what might be called the low-end stock, but do it in a quality way. So you actually get much better outcomes than some of the disasters that we see around us, where leaky homes are still being built and substandard homes are still being built. So I entirely support going to the government. I entirely support the comments that the Mayor made around value capture. It just doesn't go to this, but that is the solution to many of our issues, especially if we're actually serious about things like rail, and we want to find mechanisms to fund it, but to fund other things as well. If we can't address those structural changes, we're gone, and affordable housing is gone. So, as I say, I'm voting against A. I'm comfortable with B.
Thank you, Councillor. And Deputy Mayor Cashmore, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I guess this is the reality check of the world in which we currently live, isn't it? So inclusionary zoning would be one of those lovely things to have, but the chances of winning it are less than 10%, because what happens with inclusionary zoning is you make some houses cheaper, but the ones next door will be dearer. That's the economics of it, how it works. A lot of people have spoken and slagged off SHAs. Well, I'd actually a bit of support of SHAs. In the Franklin ward, we had Belmont, one of the first ones passed, and it delivered affordable housing in quite some quantity, and the jobs to go with it. In Pirata, Grafton Downs, same thing, and they're still being built there. The exception, of course, is Oranga, Charles Marr. Didn't do 10%, it's doing 50 and 20%. So that's the difference, where we have employment, creation, and houses being built at a considerable scale in the south. Another big change has just started, and that's the wholehearted import of steel fabricated houses out of Asia into locations in the city at a 60 to 70% cost per square metre of what we're paying for New Zealand built houses. We are seeing factory built houses in this country starting up as well. We are still growing up in the construction space here. We're not a city of 4, 5 or 6 or 10 million people. Singapore delivers 62,000 apartments a year. 62,000. And they're of quality. And their price per square metre is under half what we pay for a new house in this country. So there are answers. We just have to be brave enough to tackle it. The SHA model was flawed, it wasn't perfect. Inclusionary houses is part of the solution, but it's not perfect either. The real ability is scale. We've got to do more at scale and tackle the costs of infrastructure, because whether it's green or brown, it's expensive. If you have to pull out existing infrastructure in brownfields, as has been found out in GI, where there was no floodwater and stormwater preventions in the initial housing zones, as we are seeing out west of here currently, in the inner suburbs, but where there are massive bills because you've got to repurpose existing infrastructure that's in the ground. So none of this stuff's easy. We've had gone from population increase in the city of 5,000 to almost 50,000 since 2013-14 till now. And yet the provision of infrastructure stayed the same. The result is increasing pressures on housing. And yet we haven't had the political fortitude in Wellington to fight that. And we need to get that fortitude into Wellington to be braver. But think about the other side of that coin. You bring down the price of houses, there is a price that's paid by those who currently own them. Won't worry me, because I'm quite happy for the value of my properties to fall. But a lot of people, it would be really concerning. That's the other side of the coin. I'm supporting both of the recommendations.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Well, look, members, Councillor Bartley, would you like to speak to this? Okay, but Councillor Bartley and then myself and then Councillor Cooper to close it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just thinking of some developments in my neck of the woods where we have public money going in to provide infrastructure for housing development where there is no social housing. So we are pretty much funding an area that is for anybody that can afford to buy a house, 800 grand and up. And to me, that doesn't even value the Auckland plan about belonging and participation. I have another area where there is no social housing because there are water views. So it's only private market rentals, no social housing at all in Waitaki Bay, which means people on, high incomes get that water view and poor people don't deserve that water view. If there was some kind of inclusionary zoning, that wouldn't be the case. That would make it kind of equal for everybody to have, to be in a home that gets a nice view of the water, to be in a home in a flash area, and that's not happening. So, we're not even paying any words or action to our own Auckland plan by not doing as much as we can to achieve some kind of balance with these developments. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Bartley. Members, I have memory of 2016. Councillor Watson was reminding us of an opportunity. We could have gone with it, and I thought it was a slimmer vote margin, but foggy memory from then. But we did have an opportunity, and we walked away. And then, at that time, it was a desperate situation on affordability. We knew it. It was desperate on affordability, and it was desperate on supply. The whole focus was on supply. The SHAs were all about supply and affordability, but there was no weight to affordability. And we're seeing that in the fact that there's just been no monitoring, and we don't even have the records. And the delivery on affordability was quite pathetic. On supply, SHAs, I think the jury's out on whether they delivered on supply, actually. But in terms of the unitary plan over the last few years, the evidence is solid that the supply solution expected through the unitary plan changes is delivering. And so we've had some recent numbers, but the question of affordability has gone from, desperate to dangerous. It's at dangerous levels. And this is a chronic illness in our housing equation at the moment. We've got supply at some of the highest levels, and Chief Economist reminded us in an email just this week where we're doing the biggest numbers in the last year from any year since the mid-1990s, I think, David. Yeah, ever recorded. So on the supply side, we're doing well. On the affordability side, we are still got the handbrake on. It's so stuck that it needs a different way of getting it moved. And for me, I look at the A and look, there's a slight, softening of it there with the at this time, but I can't bring myself to support the A. I feel like I'm walking away from the problem by backing the A, and I can't walk away from this problem, and I hope that none of us walk away from this problem. It is an enormous problem. Our young people and many others do not see a future in the city they're born into. They just don't see a future here. They can't afford to live here. Our young people, some of the young people I talk to, they just laugh at the possibility of owning a home, let alone paying the rent. They don't see their futures here. So that is going to empty out the city of the talent, the young people, all the skills that are going to allow, you know, those generations that are slightly older to retire well and be supported by an earning population, a population that's contributing to the city GDP and nation's GDP. Affordability has failed through SHAs, it's failed through the Unitary Plan. I don't think it's failed at the government level as yet. You've heard Phil tell us that it really wasn't in the sort of the parameters of that National Policy Statement for Urban Development. It wasn't addressed there. Look, we've got a government that's been re-elected. They've identified housing and as a key challenge. You know, we've heard a Prime Minister talk about being a compassionate government, a government that is on the lookout for all New Zealanders. Well, I think we can work something out with the government here. And this B is really important. I think that B, we need to see how that works up. I'm not expecting a full-blown report to come back in February, but it would be good to see what that advocacy plan was, have a real well-constructed plan, work with local government and the community housing providers and others. I would like us to, Phil, to go and have a chat with David Mead at Hill Young Cooper. I'd like us to go and have a chat with the legal representatives, whoever it was in 2016, who were prepared to take the case and fight for it. This council has to lead out. It can't be a follower. This council represents 1.56 million Aucklanders, and every family, every household knows of this problem of affordability. They expect to see leadership. They expect to see it from this table. So let's demonstrate that. I can't say that A's time is now. Let's find out. Let's concentrate on B. I would prefer that A was taken off the table right now, but it is moved and seconded. So let's go with the B and have a plan and treat with government and make them really clear and sure that this is a dangerous problem for Auckland going on right now, and there's no sign of it abating. We have to tackle this one. So
can we put A and B separately, sir?
We will. But we've got other speakers. We've got Councillor Sayers and then Councillor Cooper. So I'll leave it there, members, but I'll be supporting the B and supporting the Working Party to talk to others about getting a comprehensive plan of action in place and forming that relationship with government, the key ministers, Megan Woods and others, and particularly our Auckland MPs. We've got a new Auckland Central MP, we've got new Auckland MPs from other parties across Auckland, and we've got re-elected MPs. They are aware of this problem. Let's all team up and attack it. So Councillor Sayers.
Sorry to interrupt, Councillor Sayers. Can I have a point of order? If we vote down A, can I just clarify this resolution? If we're voting down A, we're not giving staff a direction to do anything else. So all we've moved is to have an advocacy plan. We haven't told, we're silent on inclusionary zoning. Is that true?
That is as it is, but my approach is, from reading the room, we should be definitely focusing on the B and undertaking that advocacy work. If that advocacy work does not deliver results, say in the next 4, 5, 6 months, then maybe we come back to inclusionary zoning consideration.
Thanks,
That's okay. Councillor Sayers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to pick up on the point, what is affordable housing? What is that price break point for Auckland? And we had the community housing presentation today, and they mentioned from their point of view, their definition was a third of the average Auckland income. The average Auckland income, just looked it up, is 66,000. Might be a bit higher, but it's put at 66,000 on the site that I'm on at the moment. So that would make an affordable house, by their definition, around about 300,000, right? So I mention that just because of the parity difference that we're looking at here. You know, what is an affordable house to somebody? Well, apparently it's around that $300,000 mark. So how do we ever achieve that? Picking on Councillor Watson's point a bit earlier, where's the radical change that would be needed, required to get anywhere heading in that direction, or even close to it? The answer, I suggest, would rest not in the supply, not in the building costs, but the land cost. It's the supply of land, not the supply of materials. So how do you get an affordable land cost in Auckland? I think that's a conversation we have to have around the unitary plan. So I will not be supporting A, but I'm happy to support B, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Sayers. And we haven't had the opportunity to ask, or we did have the opportunity to ask the Chief Economist some questions about those very questions. And the Chief Economist has written a number of papers on that, which you might like to have a read of. Closing the debate, Councillor Cooper, please.
Thank you. There's so many points to put up, and I want to acknowledge my fellow Working Party members, because for them it's a real slap to go, oh my God, this isn't going to work. And I really acknowledge you, Kathy and Josephine, for that, because they've had to kind of go, well, this is a reality, but what else can we do? And what we can do is, because we are Auckland, we have a strong advocacy position, especially with community housing providers, other people that we know will work with us. And I, you know, part of me thinks, why do we want to subsidise, why does, probably most of us as homeowners want to subsidise other people, but I guess we do that anyway in our rates. Well, it is, if you are, you're asking developers to subsidise other people, you're asking, it is a cross-subsidy or it's a tax, and we can't actually make a tax. We tried that with the bed tax and it doesn't work. I think the thing is, there's a lot of things here. Councillor Watson talked about where are we putting land in? Well, we tried that actually, didn't we? And the local councillors went up in arms when there was parkland given back to iwi and they wanted to build housing. And everyone wanted to keep it as a park. So go find a community that wants to give up their park, especially in increasingly densified communities where I'm every day getting people going, there's 18 houses built next to me. Oh my God. And even last week, don't sell that bit of land we said we were going to sell 3 years ago and have revoked the parkland because there's going to be 200 houses built there and now we want that for a park. So I think the whole idea for me of giving over our parks for someone else to build on, it's not going to fly whether you wanted it or not, but I couldn't agree with that. We need to keep our open space in increasingly densified suburban areas. Look, I just think we've got to give it a go. I mean, I'm a bit of an advocate for, if you're going to do something, make everybody in the country do it. Make it so that there's options everywhere, not just also basically making it difficult for one area to develop, because it will make it difficult for people to develop. People don't buy land and develop it without wanting to make a profit. That's the reality. And also, lower interest rates are also, even though they're good maybe for a buyer, but they're causing a lot of the housing increases now, because now the investors are going, I can't make any money but leaving my money in the bank, so I'm going to buy some more investment houses. And so you can see the whole balance. It's a really difficult balance. I mean, whether I'm talking about, it's a whole wider picture here we're dealing with, not just one thing. But I think we've got to give it a go. We've got to give it a go. I don't want to see us just doing something that nobody else does, because then you might have developers saying, well, we're not going to build anything here. We'll go somewhere else. And then, even though we are getting supply, we've got the UPS forcing us to get even more supply. So I think that this is a compromise, and politics is the art of compromise. And some people can afford to always oppose, and that's fine. But I want to come through the middle where we can get a compromise. And also, we can't leave this silent So if you vote against A, it's left flowing in the wind and it comes back, we need our staff, our planning staff, to know where they're going with their work plan. Not who knows if this is going to come up any time. I just think we need to put the direction there. And as I think you said, Councillor Darby, if we don't get anywhere with it, we can go back to it if we've got this on the table. Because it says, if the legislation changes or anything, and we've said at this time. So at a future time, we can go back to it if we deem it the right thing to do and we can get agreement. So if you vote against that and it's not there, then we've got no direction at all other than just go and talk to the government. So I just commend both to you. Let's do as much as we can within the financial constraints we have, but use the powers we do have of influence.
Point of order, Mr Chair.
Point of order.
It arises out of the comments just made by Councillor Cooper. We are the governing body. We give instructions to our officers what we want them to do or not want them to do. So if we decide to vote down A, look, if we had, for God's sake, have the courage of our convictions. If we think they should proceed with the changes of the Auckland Unitary Plan, tell them to do it. If we don't think they should do it at this time, tell them not to do it. But we're reneging on our responsibility to give them instructions.
It's a second speaking turn, Mr Mayor.
No, I want to know, the point of order is this, Mr Chairman. I want to know what the implications are of not voting for resolution A.
I can't actually. Oh no, we can. A question at any time. The standing orders. So Phil, can you reply to the question from the Mayor, please?
Through the Chair, we do not have an active piece of work going on in preparing a plan change to the Unitary Plan at this point in time. We would actively work on B.
We're going to go to the vote, and I think there was a call for a division on both, was there? I heard it for a call, was it Councillor Walker called a division on both, so I'll hand to the governance advisors.
Thank you, members. You're voting on item 9A. Councillor Darby.
Against.
Councillor Bartley.
For.
Councillor Casey.
Yes.
Councillor Cashmore.
Aye.
Councillor Collins. Councillor Coombe.
Aye.
Councillor Cooper.
Aye.
Councillor Dalton.
Aye.
Councillor Fletcher.
Yes.
Mayor Goff.
Yes.
Member Henare.
No.
Councillor Henderson. For. Councillor Hills. No. Councillor Mulholland.
For.
Councillor Newman.
For.
Member Namane.
No.
Councillor Sayers.
I've changed my mind there. I'm going to be for. I think something has happened to that.
Councillor Simpson. Councillor Stewart. Sorry, she's not here. Councillor Walker.
I've changed my mind. I'll vote no.
Councillor Watson.
I haven't changed my mind. I'm voting no.
Councillor Young.
That was in yes.
There's a woman's prerogative.
No.
So that motion A is carried, 14 votes to 7. We'll now go for B. Was there a division call on B? Or
I'm happy to.
okay, no, I think we'll just go.
Yep.
Sorry, there was a division called by Councillor Henderson on B. Go to the vote.
Item 9B. Councillor Darby.
For.
Councillor Bartley.
For.
Councillor Casey.
Yes.
Councillor Cashmore.
Aye.
Councillor Collins. Councillor Coombe.
Aye.
Councillor Cooper.
Aye.
Councillor Dalton.
Against.
Councillor Fletcher.
Yes.
Mayor Goff.
Yes.
Member Henare.
Yep.
Councillor Henderson.
For.
Councillor Hills.
Aye.
Councillor Mulholland.
For.
Councillor Newman.
I'm against, and if it passes, send me the photos.
Member Namane.
For.
Councillor Sayers.
For.
Councillor Simpson. Councillor Walker.
Yes.
Councillor Watson. Councillor Young. Carried 19-2.
It's carried 19 votes to 2. Thanks, members. We'll now go to item 10. Item 10, it's on page 51, Auckland Unitary Plan, Schedule 10.